Did you know that Wisconsin was once one of the most politically radical states in America? That parts of it were shaped more by European socialism than American capitalism? And that the state people reduced to cheese and cold weather quietly influenced labor laws, public education, and modern democracy in ways most Americans never learned? Wisconsin isn't simple. It's not frozen in time. It's not just a punchline about dairy and football. And the story you hear about it leaves out the most important parts. Most people think they understand Wisconsin. They've seen the cheese hats, they know it's cold. They've formed opinions based on election maps and stereotypes that flatten one of America's most historically significant states into something forgettable. But Wisconsin's influence runs deeper than its image suggests. The systems Americans live under, labor protections, public universities, environmental policy, were often tested here first. Today, you'll discover 35 Wisconsin facts that challenge the narrative, and by the end, you may realize why this state is far more influential than it gets credit for. Let's begin. 35. Wisconsin was once one of America's most progressive states. Long before progressive became political branding, Wisconsin pioneered labor protections, public utilities, worker safety laws, and democratic reforms that other states eventually copied. In the early 20th century, Wisconsin was a laboratory for policies that seemed radical elsewhere, but worked here. Direct primaries, civil service reform, railroad regulation, and income taxation. The state didn't just accept new ideas, it generated them. What's now framed as politically extreme was once mainstream Wisconsin governance. The state's progressive-era reforms influenced national policy for decades. The Wisconsin people see today didn't fall from the sky. It was built on a foundation of policy innovation that shaped American government, then got quietly forgotten. 34. Milwaukee was a socialist city. Repeatedly, Milwaukee elected socialist mayors multiple times in the early 20th century. Not once as an accident, but repeatedly as a deliberate choice. These weren't revolutionaries plotting to overthrow capitalism. They were practical administrators focused on sanitation, infrastructure, public health, and honest government. Critics called them sewer socialists because they spent so much energy on unglamorous basics: clean water, functional sewers, public parks, and transparent budgets. They ran the city efficiently and won elections because they delivered results. Milwaukee's socialist period wasn't radical chaos. It was competent governance that improved daily life for working people. The label scared people elsewhere, but the results spoke for themselves. 33. Wisconsin shaped modern labor laws. Minimum wage standards, worker compensation systems, unemployment insurance, and workplace safety regulations all trace significant influence back to Wisconsin experiments conducted before the federal government acted. Wisconsin passed the first state unemployment compensation law in 1932. It pioneered workers' compensation systems that became models for other states. Labor economists and policy experts studied Wisconsin's approaches and adapted them nationally. The state was a policy laboratory before Washington paid attention, testing ideas on real populations, measuring results, and refining approaches that eventually became federal law. When Americans receive unemployment benefits or workplace injury compensation, they're benefiting from systems Wisconsin helped design. 32. The dairy image masks a complex economy. Yes, dairy matters to Wisconsin. The state produces enormous quantities of milk, cheese, and butter. The branding is effective and the pride is real. But Wisconsin's economy also grew around manufacturing, machinery, paper production, brewing, and logistics. Factories in Milwaukee, Racine, and Kenosha once employed hundreds of thousands. Paper mills in the north processed timber into products shipped nationwide. Cheese became branding, effective shorthand that stuck in popular imagination. But reducing Wisconsin to dairy erases the industrial history that shaped its cities, its labor movements, and its political character. The state is more economically diverse than the cheese hats suggest. 31. The state's German roots still shape its culture. German immigrants arrived in Wisconsin in massive waves during the 19th century, bringing with them traditions in education, brewing, farming methods, civic organization, and social life that permanently shaped the state's character. The emphasis on public education, the brewing industry that made Milwaukee famous, the singing societies and athletic clubs, the preference for organized community life. Much of what people call Midwestern culture in Wisconsin actually arrived through Germany first. German-language newspapers once circulated widely. German-style kindergartens pioneered early childhood education. The influence was so pervasive it became invisible, absorbed into what people now assume is generically American. 30. Wisconsin has more shoreline than most states. People think Wisconsin doesn't market itself as a coastal state, but geography tells a different story. Between Lake Michigan on the east, Lake Superior on the north, and thousands of inland lakes scattered throughout, Wisconsin has over 15,000 miles of shoreline. That's more than many states people associate with beaches and water recreation. The Great Lakes aren't oceans, but they function like inland seas, massive bodies of water that shape climate, transportation, and economy. Wisconsin's relationship with water defines more of its character than outsiders realize. It's more water-defined than many states with coastal reputations. 29. Freshwater, not land, is Wisconsin's strategic asset. In a world increasingly worried about water scarcity, Wisconsin sits on one of Earth's largest freshwater reserves. The Great Lakes hold roughly 20% of the world's surface fresh water. Wisconsin borders two of them. Long-term power here isn't oil extraction or tech innovation. It's water, abundant, accessible, and increasingly valuable as climate change stresses water supplies elsewhere. States that seem economically dominant today may face water crises that Wisconsin will never experience. The strategic value of Wisconsin's water position hasn't fully registered in national consciousness, but it will. Water may ultimately matter more than anything else Wisconsin has. 28. The state was built on ice. Wisconsin's lakes, rolling hills, fertile soil, and unique terrain are geological leftovers of the last ice age. Glaciers advanced and retreated across this land for thousands of years, carving lake beds, depositing soil, and shaping the landscape people now inhabit. The driftless area in southwestern Wisconsin, a region the glaciers somehow missed, looks completely different from the rest of the state, offering a glimpse of what the land looked like before ice reshaped everything else. Wisconsin's geography isn't random. It's the signature of glaciers that retreated roughly 10,000 years ago, leaving behind the terrain that made dairy farming and lake recreation possible. 27. Wisconsin once led the nation in manufacturing. Before deindustrialization hollowed out the Midwest, Wisconsin was a manufacturing powerhouse. Factories, mills, and machine shops defined entire regions. Milwaukee was one of America's great industrial cities, producing everything from motorcycles to mining equipment. Companies like Alice Chalmers, Briggs & Stratton, and Harley-Davidson employed tens of thousands. Smaller cities had their own industrial bases: paper mills, furniture factories, agricultural equipment manufacturers. Deindustrialization didn't erase that history. It hollowed it out. The buildings remain. The workers' grandchildren remain. The identity forged in factory work remains, even as the factories themselves closed or moved. 26. Rural Wisconsin was never apolitical. The image of rural America as politically passive, farmers quietly working land without engaging in politics, never matched Wisconsin's reality. Farm movements, agricultural cooperatives, populist uprisings, and organized rural resistance originated here. Wisconsin farmers organized against railroad monopolies, formed cooperatives to control their own marketing, and elected representatives who challenged corporate power. Rural didn't mean passive in Wisconsin. It meant organized, often radical, and deeply engaged with political and economic systems that affected farm families directly. The politically active rural Wisconsin of today has historical roots deeper than recent elections suggest. 25. The University of Wisconsin was designed to serve the public. The Wisconsin idea, the principle that the university should serve all the state's citizens, not just enrolled students, shaped how public higher education developed nationwide. University of Wisconsin faculty advised state government on policy. Extension programs brought agricultural research directly to farmers. The boundaries between campus and community were deliberately blurred. This wasn't charity, it was philosophy. Education exists to improve people's lives beyond classroom walls. The idea influenced public universities across America and established a model for what state-funded education could accomplish. The Wisconsin idea has been challenged and eroded over time, but its influence on American higher education remains enormous. 24. The state's politics didn't always look like they do. Now Wisconsin's current political alignment isn't permanent. The state shifted, gradually, as industries declined, populations moved, identities hardened, and national polarization sorted voters into new coalitions. The Wisconsin that elected progressive-era reformers, socialist mayors, and liberal senators didn't vanish overnight. It transformed over decades as economic foundations shifted beneath it. Political change followed economic change. Factory closures, farm consolidations, and demographic shifts reshaped who lived where and what they believed. The current political map is a snapshot, not a destiny. States don't have fixed political identities. They have populations responding to conditions, and conditions keep changing. 23. Wisconsin has quiet income inequality. Income inequality in Wisconsin doesn't always look as extreme as in coastal states with visible billionaires and obvious poverty, but it exists, especially between regions. Madison's prosperity doesn't extend to rural counties losing population. Milwaukee's challenges differ from suburban comfort surrounding it. Northern Wisconsin's economy operates under different pressures than the southern tier. Statewide averages hide these disparities. Wisconsin is doing fine can mean Madison is thriving, while other regions struggle. The inequality is quiet because it's geographic, concentrated in places that don't generate headlines. But quiet inequality still shapes lives. 22. Madison is an outlier within the state. Madison operates under a different economic and cultural reality than much of Wisconsin. The state capital, anchored by the University of Wisconsin and state government employment, has a highly educated population, stable public sector jobs, and a thriving service economy. This makes Madison genuinely different from Milwaukee's industrial legacy, from rural agricultural communities, and from small towns built around manufacturing that left. The internal divide between Madison and the rest of Wisconsin fuels misunderstanding and resentment. What works in Madison doesn't automatically work elsewhere. What Madison residents believe doesn't reflect statewide consensus. Madison is part of Wisconsin, but often feels like a different state entirely. 21. Wisconsin's alcohol culture has legal roots. Wisconsin's relationship with alcohol isn't just cultural tradition, it's built into legal frameworks that developed over more than a century. Lower drinking ages in the past, lenient tavern licensing laws, community brewing traditions brought by German immigrants, and a regulatory environment that accommodated alcohol rather than restricting it all normalized drinking in ways that persist today. Wisconsin consistently ranks among states with highest alcohol consumption. Taverns anchor small-town social life in ways that don't exist in states that regulated differently. This isn't moral judgment, it's observation. Legal and cultural history created patterns that remain visible in public health statistics and social norms. 20. The state helped shape. Modern environmental policy conservation, land management, and sustainable forestry developed in Wisconsin partly out of necessity. After logging stripped northern forests in the late 19th century, the state faced ecological consequences that demanded response. Aldo Leopold, the father of wildlife ecology, developed his land ethic while working in Wisconsin. The state pioneered forestry management practices, conservation education, and environmental protection frameworks that influenced national policy. Wisconsin's environmentalism wasn't hippie idealism. It was practical response to visible degradation, watching what happened when resources were extracted without thought for consequences. The environmental movement has many roots. Wisconsin's are often overlooked. 19. Wisconsin has always been a borderland. Wisconsin sits at the intersection of multiple American regions, Midwest, Great Lakes, and Northern Plains, absorbing influence from all directions without fitting neatly into any single category. Southern Wisconsin feels Midwestern. Northern Wisconsin feels like the North Woods extending from Minnesota and Michigan. The Lake Michigan shore connects to Chicago's orbit. The Mississippi River border ties western Wisconsin to Iowa and Minnesota. This borderland status means Wisconsin lacks the clear regional identity that defines states more firmly planted in one cultural zone. It's too northern to be purely Midwestern, too Midwestern to be purely northern. Wisconsin absorbs influences and fits none perfectly. 18. Small towns once held significant economic power. Before consolidation concentrated economic activity in larger cities, Wisconsin's small towns anchored real economic power. Local factories and mills employed residents who spent wages in local businesses. Banks served local needs. Decisions that affected communities were made within them. When those factories closed, towns didn't fail because residents lacked work ethic or capability. Systems failed, supply chains that moved elsewhere, corporate decisions made in distant headquarters, economic forces beyond local control. The hollowing of small-town Wisconsin wasn't inevitable natural decline. It was the result of choices made elsewhere that withdrew investment from communities that had functioned for generations. 17. Wisconsin's population is aging faster than many states. Demographics are quietly reshaping Wisconsin. Younger residents leave for opportunities elsewhere. Older residents stay or return for retirement. Birth rates decline while life expectancy increases. The result is a population that's aging faster than workforce replacement can match. This affects labor supply, healthcare systems, school enrollments, and tax bases. An aging population isn't a crisis by itself, but it requires adaptation. Services designed for younger populations need restructuring. Economic development strategies need updating. Political priorities shift when median voter age rises. Wisconsin's demographic transition is underway. Its full effects haven't arrived yet. 16. Public services were once the state's pride. Wisconsin once took pride in public services, infrastructure, education, and utilities as investments in collective prosperity, not just expenses to minimize. Public universities were accessible and well-funded. Roads were maintained. State agencies were competent and professional. Government wasn't the enemy. It was the mechanism through which citizens accomplished shared goals. That mindset changed over time. Tax cuts reduced revenue. Privatization transferred functions to for-profit entities. Rhetoric shifted from public investment to government burden. Whether the current direction is progress or decline depends on perspective. But the change from Wisconsin's earlier philosophy is real and measurable. 15. The nice stereotype. Hides conflict. Minnesota nice gets more attention. But Wisconsin has its own version of Midwestern politeness that obscures deeper realities. Politeness doesn't equal agreement. Indirect communication doesn't mean absence of conflict. Disagreements in Wisconsin are often expressed sideways, through passive resistance, quiet non-cooperation, and carefully worded objections that avoid direct confrontation. This can make Wisconsin seem calmer than it actually is. The conflicts exist, they're just fought differently than in places where direct confrontation is normalized. Understanding Wisconsin requires reading between the lines of polite conversation to see the disagreements that civility partially conceals. 14. Wisconsin was central to the Union. During the Civil War, despite being a young state far from the battlefields, Wisconsin contributed troops, resources, and leadership to the Union cause, well beyond what its population suggested it should. Nearly 92,000 Wisconsin men served in the Union Army, a remarkable percentage of the state's population. Wisconsin regiments fought at Gettysburg, Antietam, and Sherman's March. The state's commitment to the Union was significant and costly. This history gets less attention than border state drama or Southern battlefield narratives, but Wisconsin's Civil War contribution shaped the state's identity and its relationship to the national project for generations. 13. The decline of manufacturing changed. Everything economic security once held Wisconsin communities together. Factory jobs provided middle-class incomes without college degrees. Union membership offered collective power. Stable employment allowed families to plan futures. When manufacturing declined, through automation, offshoring, and corporate restructuring, more than jobs disappeared. Identity, community, stability, and economic predictability all eroded simultaneously. The loss reshaped politics, family structures, and regional self-understanding. What replaced manufacturing work rarely offered the same combination of income, benefits, and dignity. Understanding contemporary Wisconsin requires understanding what disappeared, not just economically, but psychologically. 12. The state's political fights are about control of institutions. Wisconsin's fiercest political battles often concern control of institutions rather than abstract ideological debates. Courts, electoral districts, university governance, civil service systems, and regulatory agencies. Whoever controls these structures shapes policy for years, regardless of election outcomes. Gerrymandered districts, court appointments, and agency rules can lock in advantages that survive changing public opinion. The fights look like partisan warfare, but they're really about structural power, who controls the mechanisms that implement policy and adjudicate disputes. Wisconsin's political intensity reflects genuine stakes, institutions that determine what's possible beyond any single election. 11. Wisconsin is a testing ground again, just differently. Wisconsin's reputation as a policy laboratory didn't end with the progressive era. The state remains a testing ground, but the experiments have shifted direction. Policies restricting union power, reforming public education, restructuring state agencies, and limiting government authority have been tested here as intensively as progressive reforms were tested a century ago. Whether these experiments succeed or fail depends on perspective and time horizon. But Wisconsin's role as a place where ideas are tested before spreading elsewhere continues. The laboratory is still open. The hypothesis being tested changed. 10. The narrative focuses on division, not history. National media covers Wisconsin primarily through the lens of political division. Swing state elections, partisan battles, and cultural conflict. This focus erases the state's complexity. Wisconsin becomes a prize to win rather than a place with history, institutions, and people whose lives extend beyond voting patterns. Simplified stories serve media needs but distort understanding. Wisconsin didn't begin in 2016. Its current politics didn't emerge from nowhere, but the narrative rarely includes the history that explains the present. Division makes headlines. Context rarely does. 9. Rural and urban Wisconsin depend on each other here more than they admit. The political divide between rural and urban Wisconsin obscures economic interdependence. Milwaukee and Madison need food production, natural resources, and workers from rural areas. Rural Wisconsin needs markets, services, and institutions that cities provide. Supply chains, healthcare systems, education networks, and transportation infrastructure connect regions that vote differently into functional wholes. Political rhetoric emphasizes division. Economic reality demonstrates connection. Neither rural nor urban Wisconsin could function as well without the other, even if both sides sometimes pretend otherwise. Interdependence persists despite the arguments about it. 8. The state's future hinges on water and infrastructure. Wisconsin's long-term trajectory depends more on water management and infrastructure maintenance than on culture war outcomes. Climate change will increase Wisconsin's water advantage as other regions dry, but capturing that advantage requires infrastructure investment. Water treatment systems, transportation networks, energy grids, and broadband access that make the state competitive. Debates about values and identity dominate political conversation, but physical capacity, the actual systems that allow economies to function, will determine what's possible. Wisconsin's future is a question of pipes and wires as much as beliefs and votes. 7. Wisconsin was never quiet. The stereotype of Wisconsin as a calm, passive, conflict-free place never matched reality. The state argued, constantly, about labor rights, education policy, environmental protection, and political reform. What differed was style. Wisconsin argued without shouting, organized without drama, and fought political battles through institutions rather than spectacle. This made Wisconsin's conflicts less visible to outsiders accustomed to louder political cultures. But the intensity was real, just expressed differently. Wisconsin was never quiet. It just processed conflict in ways that didn't translate well to national media coverage. 6. Many national trends appeared here. First, political patterns, cultural shifts, and economic transitions that later swept the nation often appeared in Wisconsin earlier, just without the branding that would have made them recognizable. The rural-urban divide, the decline of union power, the political realignment of working-class whites, the transformation of public universities, all were visible in Wisconsin before becoming national stories. Wisconsin wasn't unique in experiencing these changes. It was early, a preview of transformations that eventually affected the entire country. The state's experience offered warnings that were largely ignored until the trends went national. 5. The state isn't regressing. It's reconfiguring. Critics describe Wisconsin's recent trajectory as regression, a retreat from progressive traditions towards something darker. But reconfiguration might be more accurate. The state is reorganizing around different priorities, different coalitions, and different understandings of what government should do. Whether that reconfiguration is progress or decline depends entirely on values and perspective. What's certain is that change is happening, and it's not simply reversal to some previous state. Wisconsin isn't moving backward to a fixed past. It's moving towards something new that hasn't fully formed yet. 4. Leaving Wisconsin doesn't mean rejecting it. Many people leave Wisconsin for jobs, climate, opportunity, or personal reasons. This migration is often framed as rejection or failure, but leaving can also be adaptation. People who love Wisconsin may still need what it can't currently provide. Departure doesn't necessarily mean the state failed or that the person who left has abandoned their identity. Migration is complicated. Reducing it to simple narratives of loyalty or betrayal misunderstands why people make the choices they make. Many who leave Wisconsin carry it with them, and some eventually return. 3. Staying requires reimagining what the state can be. For those who stay in Wisconsin, the challenge isn't preserving the past, but imagining what's next. The state's progressive era innovations emerged from specific conditions that no longer exist. The manufacturing economy that supported middle-class life has transformed. The demographics have shifted. The challenges are different. The past offers clues about Wisconsin's capacity for innovation and adaptation, but not blueprints that can be copied directly. Staying in Wisconsin and thriving requires creative thinking about possibilities the past didn't anticipate. 2. Wisconsin's story was simplified for convenience. Complex histories are harder to sell than simple stereotypes. Wisconsin became the cheese state and a swing state because those labels are easy to communicate and remember. The full story, progressive era innovation, socialist mayors, labor movement leadership, environmental policy development, demographic transformation, economic restructuring, doesn't fit into sound bites. Simplification serves convenience but costs understanding. What gets left out often matters more than what gets included. Wisconsin's story was simplified because complexity doesn't trend. That doesn't make the complexity less real. 1. Wisconsin isn't what the narrative says. It never was. It's not just cheese. It's not just cold. It's not just a political battleground to be won or lost every 4 years. Wisconsin is a state that shaped systems most Americans live under: labor laws, public education models, environmental frameworks, democratic reforms, and rarely acknowledge. The narrative reduces Wisconsin to stereotypes because stereotypes are easier. The reality is more interesting, more influential, and more complicated than the image allows. Wisconsin matters more than people know. It just never learned how to brag about it. Which of these Wisconsin facts challenged what you thought you knew? Or which one do you think people outside the state completely miss? Drop it in the comments. And if there's a Wisconsin truth we didn't cover, add it below. We read every comment. There's another video on screen uncovering truths about another place people think they understand. Subscribe to Hard Truth Untold, because the most important stories are usually the ones simplified away.